Well, let me introduce you to some people to start talking this through. Maajid Nawaz is with me here in the World Have Your Say studio, British-born Muslim, co-founder of the Quilliam Foundation and author of the book Radical. Welcome to the programme, Maajid.
A pleasure, thank you.
Asra Nomani's with us too from Washington, D.C., author of Standing Alone in Mecca and a writer for The Daily Beast. Hi there, Asra. Welcome to World Have Your Say.
Hey, thanks, Sue.
We can also speak to Bjorn Stark, who's a blogger in Oslo in Norway. Welcome to the programme, Bjorn.
Thank you.
Let me start with Maajid. What do you think when you see these pictures?
Well, I've got to say that I think these demonstrations that have been spread across the world are the largest act of self-defeat that Muslims who are participating in these protests, and I qualify that statement because, of course, the majority of Muslims are not participating in these protests, but those who have, it's very self-defeating. I think all it's going to achieve is, I think I actually jokingly tweeted a couple of days ago that if you want to become famous, make or do something blasphemous against Islam, and your fame will become guaranteed by our own, and I say our own as in Muslims, reaction. And that's sadly the state of affairs. All it will achieve, it will make these fringe amateur film producers famous. It will also encourage others, and there is a very serious global right-wing anti-Islam and anti-Muslim network. It will encourage them to produce more such blasphemous material, and it will only further divide and entrench these differences. So I think it's self-defeating, and I think it's probably one last thing I'd say is that though of course people are angry that somebody very dear to them has been insulted in this way, I think there are other factors at play here which I'd like the opportunity to discuss at some stage as well.
Sure, well thanks for that, and we'll get on to that. And I didn't introduce Dr. Reza Pankhurst at the beginning of the programme because we were trying to get through to him and having some difficulty, but we have got through to you now, sir, so welcome to the programme. A member of the Hizb ut-Tahrir political party and was at a protest, I think, at the weekend. But we'll come to you in a moment because I'm interested to hear, Bjorn, what do you think of these pictures?
Well, I've seen people place some of the responsibility on the filmmakers, but I think we should keep in mind that this movie is a peaceful statement. It may be stupid, it may be offensive to some, but it is a peaceful statement, and peaceful statements should be met with peaceful criticism. So the one thing that really matters here is that everybody in the world should be free to speak their minds without being murdered for it, or beaten up, or threatened, or sent to prison. Those are the ground rules. So I worry that there's a culture of fear all over the world today, and we've seen this before. There was Salman Rushdie, there was Theo van Gogh, there was Danish cartoons. There's a culture of fear where people all over the world are afraid that if they say something that happens to offend some Muslims, then they are in a very real danger of being murdered. And that culture of fear is a big problem. It's a much bigger problem than some YouTube clip.
Asra, respond to Bjorn. Asra Nomani, can you hear me? Maybe your lines.
I can.
Good stuff.
You.
Yeah, go ahead and give us your take on what you've heard so far.
Yeah, I agree that this is self-defeating. I agree that this is an embarrassment to Muslims, and I agree that we should not just place the blame on the filmmakers in terms of the thoughts that we've already heard. I believe that, in our Muslim community, we are really immature right now. And this is a reflection of our immaturity. I'm the mother of a 9-year-old, and I can tell you that if my son came home and told me that somebody had offended him, I would not encourage him to go burn down their house. And for us in our Muslim community to sanction any kind of violence or outrage of this proportion is, to me, morally reprehensible and completely contradictory to any principles that any faith should practice. What I believe that the protests reveal is the fact that we're a community that has really bad leaders. We are a community that does not have leaders that, inspire us to rise to our higher selves, but rather we're very tribal and we want to go an eye for an eye. And there's no offense that I think sanctions this kind of violence. I agree with what Bjorn says, that, this movie, while offensive to many people, is not an act of violence in itself. And for somebody to take it as that is their perception. It's their It's their issue. And in that way, in our community, we need to take responsibility for our lack of responsibility and mature as a psyche, and so that we respond with more wisdom.
Dr. Reza Pankhurst, come in there.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me on the show. First of all, I'd like to say that, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, is the most beloved to the Muslims. And so any kind of insult, especially of the vile nature of this film, is something that is going to offend millions of Muslims across the world, billions of Muslims across the world, actually. And it's a red line that they can't accept. This is the first point. The second point is that Islamic tradition has a long tradition of engaging in debate and discussion and criticism, but this is not an issue of debate and discussion. It's an issue of insults which have been, sent gratuitously, if you like, and this is crossing a red line that Muslims can't accept. I'd like to pick up on the point that was made about the ground rules of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech seems to be something that is brought out a lot when it comes to the right to insult Muslims, such as with the cartoons or with this film. But if we look across the West, including in America, where, for example, you have the case of Tariq Mahenna, who was jailed for 17 years for translating an ebook which was widely available on the internet. You have the case in England. The man has just been recently convicted, Azhar Ahmed, of writing some offensive statements regarding the soldiers in Afghanistan and the dead soldiers in Afghanistan. You have these cases again and again, and so Muslims are right to look at this and to think, well, there's a certain double standard going on. You can have freedom of speech as long as you're insulting Muslims, but as soon as you say something that offends the West in terms of their foreign policy or that they consider to be crossing their red lines, then the freedom of speech goes out of the window. Now,
sorry.
The final point that I wanted to make.
Well, hang on. Let's go one point at a time, because it's really useful with this to make one point at a time. Let's make one point at a time, and then we can respond to that. And I was just about to let Maajid respond to that, and then Azra, I'll certainly let you do that afterwards.
Excuse me. Do you mind if I just finish?
Well, no, because to be honest, I just want Maajid to respond to the point that you made, and then please come back and make your next point.
I think there's a few points that Reza raised. Of course, Muslims are offended by this film, but that's not the. I don't think that's the point for discussion, because offence, what it shouldn't do is lead to the violence, the level of violence that we've seen in the minority of cases. And what I'd be really happy to hear is as loud a condemnation of such violence as we are condemning something that offends us. I think when words such as red line are used, I think it needs to be clarified exactly what we mean by that, because it can sound, and I'm sure that's not how Reza meant it to sound, and he's probably going to clarify, that it can sound like a threat to say that if you do this, it's a red line and we will. And the question is, what is the we will next? Because it's not a red line for the rest of the world. And I think, finally, what I'd say is these freedom of speech points that were made, I think they are drawing analogies that are inaccurate. The conviction that happened in the UK, though I disagree with that conviction, by the way, the judge did decide that it's because the man posted threats of violence to the soldiers and not because he said something that did not lead to violence. And I disagree with the conviction, because as a law graduate, and I think that threats of violence in the general sense, generally directed to soldiers, isn't the same as specifying somebody and then threatening to attack them. That's when it becomes a direct threat, not when you generally threaten a group. So I think, Reza, your analogies have been incorrect.
Reza, clarify your red line comments, and then we'll get Azra to come in, but I'm interested. It's a really interesting area. What do you consider the red line to be?
No. If I could just finish the point which I was trying to make on my previous comment, because I didn't actually get beyond that. The issue which I was trying to say next is this, coming to Maajid's point, for example, freedom of speech has been shown to be hypocritical in this case. He mentions the case of Azhar Ahmed. If you read the Facebook comments, he didn't make any direct threats of violence. What he said was, these soldiers can go to hell. That's the exact words he used. When we look at the case of Tariq Mahenna, again, it's explicit hypocrisy and double standard. However, that's not my real point here. My real point is, as I was about to say, that it requires leadership in the Middle East to stand up and say these kind of insults are not acceptable. And when that kind of leadership is not forthcoming, from the political leadership, that's when people take to the streets. So we don't justify people taking to the streets and committing acts of violence, but the fact is they are going onto the streets in order to express themselves against these red lines which have been crossed, and they are tired of it. And we need to put it into context, actually. It's a global context, not just to do with insulting Islam. There is, wars going on in Afghanistan. There's predator drones flying over Libya. There's people being killed in Yemen, in Somalia, in Pakistan. And all of this is a context which is being missed completely, along with decades of American support for Mubarak, for Gaddafi, and for all the other tyrants and dictators inside the region. We can't simply take this one issue, take it out of context, and say, oh, look, Muslims get offended when their prophet is insulted, disregarding 50 years of colonial history, disregarding the fact that Muslims are at the end of, all of these kind of crimes which have been committed and have been exposed in front of the world's media. It's not something new that I'm saying here. The latest thing is just yesterday, 8 women and children were killed in Afghanistan by NATO, and one man who was cleared to be released from Guantanamo Bay in 2006 died after 6 further years. He was arrested in 2002. Okay. 10 years being held in Guantanamo Bay.
If I could I speak for a moment? So what I just had to laugh when Maajid was speaking about what the leadership needs to do in our communities, because I think it's exactly...
You mean the gentleman just speaking? It's Reza.
Yes.
Yeah, that's Reza.
Yeah, exactly.
Maajid's with me in the studio, and you're listening to Reza there on the phone, and you can talk directly to him.
I was just laughing, Reza, at what you had to offer as advice for our leadership, because the advice that you're offering to me is exactly the opposite of what we need to be doing. What I hear from you is the collective grievances of a society that is stuck on replaying and playing and replaying all of its grievances against the West, instead of taking leadership and actually moving us into a progressive age of advancement. It's your kind of, excuse me for a second, it's your kind of mentality that I think is basically represents the couch jihadis, the people who are stoking us and angering us so that we take into the streets, instead of actually, improving our lot and improving our educational system, improving our societies. What the sociologists say is that you have an opportunity when you have wounds. These are wounds that we have. You can either collect the wounds and define yourself as victims, or you can actually improve your lot. And that's what I would wish our community would do, instead of taking the kind of approach that you're suggesting, which is just, let's lay them all out. Guantanamo, the wars, the colonialism, sure, those are realities, but let's get past it and let's actually move forward instead of constantly pouring salt in the wounds.
And I'm mentioning to you the death of a man just yesterday.
Reza.
Yeah, well, I can tell you the death of a woman. I can tell you...
Reza.
Hang on, all of you. Let's all stop one moment. We can't all talk at once, obviously, because we won't be able to hear anyone. Reza, let's just let Reza respond, and then let's bring in Maajid, who's been listening to your exchange. Go on, Reza.
I'm afraid that I feel that... sorry, I missed her name.
That's Azra. That's Azra you can speak to.
I'm afraid that Azra is living inside a parallel universe whereby all of these grievances somehow took place 50 years or more ago. I just mentioned, just for the sake of the examples, 8 women killed yesterday by a NATO strike, a man who died in Guantanamo Bay in suspicious circumstances after 10 years of torture and illegal imprisonment, and you're talking about get over it. It's very easy for you to say get over it, but what about the people who are living these things day in, day out?
So I think this is what...
And let's let Maajid chip in now.
This is what you see for your listeners. This is what I would describe classically as the Islamist narrative that Reza is pushing here. And the reason I say that is that a lot of the agitators behind these demonstrations across the globe are basically, rightly so, aggrieved. Now, every single grievance that, Reza, you've mentioned is a legitimate grievance. I disagree with Guantanamo Bay. I disagree with the invasion of Iraq. The problem with this narrative is that it's a half-truth. It's not a lie, but it's a half-truth. And the other half of the truth is in fact what's being concealed by Islamist agitators, because their political credibility and kudos rests upon the ability to whip up this anger, bring out people into the streets so that they can recruit from them. Now, the reason I say this is half a truth is, what's the other half? The other half is, it's a fact that more Muslims have died from Al-Qaeda attacks than from anyone else. But we never see groups such as the one Reza belongs to, or any other Islamist group, out on the streets protesting against Al-Qaeda and burning Al-Qaeda flags or anything of the like. We also know for a fact that at the end of the day, more Muslims have been killed in Syria And there should be more anger over what's happening in Syria right now by Bashar al-Assad. But we didn't see this level of anger against the Syrian regime. Now, I know Reza disagrees with Bashar al-Assad, as I do, but the protests on this level didn't take off across the world for the Muslims in Syria, to a point where many, many Muslims in Syria have expressed their utter frustration at the way in which an innocuous film made by an amateur film producer has gotten more attention globally than what's going on in Syria. Now, there are real Muslims being killed by other Muslims, not by the West. And I think this half-truth narrative that somehow the West is only killing Muslims, when in fact we do more to kill each other than anyone else. Yeah. So please focus your anger correctly.
I think that Maajid Nawaz is pushing the Blair narrative at the moment. You know, the kind of narrative that likes to wash the hands. We accept some culpability for what we've done. We accept the fact that we've stoked up the sectarian tensions in Iraq. But now we don't accept the responsibility of the aftermath. In the same way that Hillary Clinton, in this particular issue, says that I find the film disgusting, but the person is free to insult Islam as he wishes from the United States of America, and there's no problem with that whatsoever, trying to wash the hands of the American government.
No one's washing hands, Reza. Every one of the grievances you mentioned are legitimate. What I'm saying is you're peddling half a truth, and the other half is Al-Qaeda have killed more Muslims than anyone else, and you never demonstrate against Al-Qaeda.
And let me just chip in there and remind everybody that we're listening to people discuss on the BBC's World Have Yours Say the images that many of you are sharing from protests around the world in response to the film clip posted on YouTube, made in America, and it's caused offence, it seems, to a great many people who are protesting around the world. You can call in and join this live conversation on World Have Yours Say. Country code 4420 31 624242. Lots of you are getting in touch online as well. Lucas in Ohio tweets using the hashtag WHYS and saying what the images mean to him. Frustration that people in the Middle East lash out blindly against the West, in inverted commas, because of one inconsiderate person's actions. Who else is getting in touch here? Arsla tweets using the hashtag WISE again. I'm disappointed that major news outlets use such images of minorities to represent the larger moderate Muslims. And Mike replied to our daily email we send out on World Have Yours Say every day. And he says, he's in the UK, he says, have you no sense of humour? We can laugh at ourselves, why can't you? What's the big deal? Did we go off the dial at Monty Python's Life of Brian? No, we didn't. Bjorn, we've not heard from you for a while. What do you make of that? And then I'll invite the other guests to respond too. Does that chime with you?
It's interesting that you mentioned Life of Brian, because I live in a country where Life of Brian was banned when it first came out here in Norway because it was blasphemous, and Christians in Norway were offended by that. But we. And Reza made a comment that, well, Muslims love Muhammad and they feel offended. Well, I know a lot of Christians. They love Jesus, but just as much as Muslims love Muhammad. But and in my society, we blaspheme against Christianity all the time. We do that, but Christians have learned to live with that, and they have learned to respond to that with criticism, with words. There's no double standard here. You can criticize, you can make fun of any religion in the world, all over the world. But the one exception that poses a threat to your life is Muhammad. So the people who are responsible for the cartoons a couple of years ago, they live in fear of their lives. They have been tried and attempted murdered several times, and no other form of blasphemy has that effect, and that worries me.
If I could say something,
please do, Asra. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, what I believe has happened is that attitudes like Reza's expressed here, trying to basically tell the world these grievances as exactly what I think Maajid very well put as half-truths of reality, is what frustrates many people in the West. After 9/11. I think a lot of people would have appreciated the kind of signs and expression of sorrow that the Libyans had about Ambassador Stevens' death. But instead, we had a lot of silence, and we had a lot of groups that wanted to blame the Jews and blame Israel on 9/11 instead of taking responsibility for the kind of extremism we have in our community. And I think Reza and his organization contribute to that kind of attitude in which the rest of the world doesn't feel like we're holding ourselves accountable. We're not owning up to our own problem of extremism. All we want to do is point fingers at others. And so I think now, 11 years after September 11th, people are very angry, and that anger on the side of many people in the West also reflects a frustration within our Muslim community. And again, for this kind of moment to be taken to the streets with violence and rage and rampage against the West is another further indication that we don't own our problems, and we want to just keep blaming others for offending us or grieving us or doing something or the other, instead of actually being constructive and being citizens in our community that better the world, rather than constantly point to the problems that we face because everybody hates us as Muslims.
Let Reza respond to that. A quick minute to go before the news, Reza. Just reply to Azra there.
Yes, two quick points. The first point is the issue of half-truths in the West. I mean, why don't we complain, or why don't you complain, when the West, as in Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, have been telling people, well, we don't understand why this has happened, for example, in Egypt when we helped them liberate themselves. We don't know why this has happened in Libya when we helped them liberate themselves. As though they have wiped out just last 2 years ago that they were supporting Mubarak to the hilt, that they were working, CIA were working with Gaddafi and rendering people to Libya. These are the half-truths that you're not talking about, and that's what makes people inside the Muslim world very, very angry. The second point that I wanted to make very quickly is no one is justifying violence on the street. My organization, Hizb ut-Tahrir, is not justifying violence on the streets. People accept that what happened in terms of the violence in front of these embassies is wrong. It's
Reza, your organisation believes in executing apostates.
Well, I have to jump in there because we are coming up to the news. I said a quick minute. Of course, most minutes are around about a minute long. But anyway, Andy in Singapore's emailed World Have Your Say. Quite honestly, I'm disgusted, angry and disgusted again. I've just seen an image from Australia of a small child holding a sign urging the beheading of those who insult Islam. That was on a number of sites, I think, wasn't it? Carol emailed World Have Your Say. The film was bad, but everyone has the right to freedom of speech and their opinion. We'll pick up on the conversation just after the news.
We've heard the news from the BBC. Now it's your turn.
You can post on facebook.com/World Have Your Say or get in touch via Twitter at BBC_WHYS.
Welcome to World Have Your Say.
Hello there, welcome back. We're talking through your response to the countless images of protests from around the world, from demonstrations against the YouTube video clip which has angered many Muslims. Riak in Tunisia has just called to say the film's producer lives in a country where there is freedom of speech. We can't take offence at every little thing. Yanni in Canada sent us an email, worldhaveyoursay@bbc.com. Muslims need to respond in kind, movies for movies, books with books. There's enough material to put the Prophet in a good light and promote it worldwide. You can post on facebook.com/World Have Your Say to join in the discussion.
If you don't want to make an international call, text country code 447786 20 60 80 and put "call me" in your message.
And there are lots of headlines today to go through, and one of the reasons that you're talking about this and clicking on this story is that protests are happening in lots and lots of different places around the world. At least one protester was killed in violence in Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. A local press club was burnt down there today. US and Israeli flags were burnt in southern Filipino city of Marawi today. The leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, appeared in public for the first time in 9 months to address protests there today too. And also you'll have heard in the news bulletin that Pakistan appears to have restricted access to YouTube, so says Ali Maqbool Arman in Islamabad, and the AFP news agency are reporting that attempts to access YouTube met with a message saying the website had been classed as containing indecent material and blocked on the orders of the Pakistan Telecom Authority. Right, let me introduce you to some more people to discuss this, along with Maajid Nawaz, who's with us from Before the News, Dr. Reza Pankhurst as well, Asra Namani in Washington DC. We have Bjorn as well, a blogger in Oslo. Let me introduce you though also to Nirvana Mahmood, a British Egyptian doctor and political blogger, with us from our studio in Salford in the north of England. Welcome to the programme, Nirvana.
Oh, hello there. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, well, thanks for coming on the programme. How do you feel about seeing these pictures from around the world?
it is so frustrating, particularly to hear some of your guests, particularly Reza, and his comments about what's happening. And if you don't mind, can I just say to Reza a Quranic verse in Arabic, Surah Al-Zumar, وَلَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةً وِزْرَ أُخْرَى, which is in English basically two wrong don't make a right. He can address all the grievance of the West, but why, even if he is completely right, why we have to imitate the West when the West go wrong? So why we have to be violent because the West was violent with us? What I learned from the Prophet is grace. The Prophet, when he conquered Mecca, didn't torture or kill or abuse any of those who offended him, hurt him, and mock him. Abu Jahl, Abu Lahab were the fiercest enemy of the Prophet. Yet the Prophet have done nothing physically to them.
Okay,
so,
well, Reza, do you want to reply to Nirvana and have a chat?
Come back on that. Look, no one is condoning violence in this case. What I'm pointing out is that the blood-stained track record of Western foreign policy means that it's just completely illegitimate for them to try and argue that it's unacceptable response. I mean, they forfeited the moral right to be talking like that. Now the question is, how do we explain this, and what is the solution for this? And the way that we explain this is that people are frustrated. They feel their honor and their dignity has been stepped on again. After all of these wars and grievances, which are still ongoing, they feel that their dignity has been stepped on again. And they do not have a political leadership that comes out and expresses this in the appropriate time. And I'd like to give an example. Look, historically, in the 19th century, there was a French playwright, Bonnier, who was writing an anti-Islamic play which is entitled Mohammed. And in 1890, the French government actually banned the play from being shown because they were afraid of offending the Ottoman state underneath the leadership of Abdul Hamid al-Thani at that time, Abdul Hamid II at that time. And the reason they did that was because they were afraid of pushing Turkey closer towards Germany. So they did it for the sake of their interest. In the same way, we need an Islamic leadership inside the Middle East. So when these kind of events occur...
Sorry, Reza, you're being very disingenuous here. And I just want to say, because I know exactly what...
Hang on one sec.
Let me finish my point.
Very quickly, Reza, wrap your point up and then bring in Maajid.
The Islamic leadership would stand up and would say from the first day, look, what you have done, what you have allowed is unacceptable. Yes, it's one of your citizens. Yes, you believe in free speech, supposedly. However, we cannot accept this. If you insist upon allowing him to propagate this throughout the world, then we'll cut our relationships with you.
Right, Reza, that's not what you believe. Basically,
embassy protests with you and whatever else.
Okay, Reza, allow me to comment.
Allow me to comment, Reza. I think you're being very disingenuous because Muslims all over the world are tired of being stuck in the middle of a rock and a hard place between aggressive invasions and occupations by wrong international foreign policies, and on the other hand, we've got people like you in the organization you belong to claiming and rightly so, as I said, your grievances you've listed are correct, but you are giving half a truth because your solution is just as bad, if not worse. And how I mean is you believe in erecting a global superstate that believes in offensive jihad to invade countries when you haven't been invaded by giving them three choices, that either they become Muslims or they pay a head tax called the jizya under your authority, or you will invade them in a jihad. I think also you believe, Reza, that if somebody apostatizes in your caliphate that you're talking about, which isn't really the caliphate, that you will execute them with death. You also believe that if somebody blasphemes under the authority of your caliphate, they will be criminally punished. Now, the problem is that there's a rock and a hard place.
We could probably do lots of programmes on the specifics of Hizb ut-Tahrir and exactly what Reza, your organisation, stands for. Just very briefly, I should give you the chance to respond briefly to what Maajid just said, but then we'll move on because I know Mike in Cleveland's given us a call. Go on, just respond very briefly to that, Reza.
I'm not surprised he's saying such things. He's a member of the Liberal Democrats Friends for Israel. So that sums up his political position.
I'm not a member of the Liberal Democrats Friends for Israel. Stand corrected, please. Sorry, stand corrected, please. Stand corrected, please.
I think you've just made your point and you've responded to it, so that's fine. Let's just move on, because I think we're not going to get anywhere if we go into the details of things that you're completely going to disagree on. I know Mike has called us from Cleveland, Ohio, where we're on public radio on WCPN. Hello, Mike. Welcome to the programme. What would you like to say?
Hello. I just like to say that I'm a part of a group called Communities in Conversation in Cleveland, where we bring together Jews, Muslims, and Christians and talk about the commonalities that the religions have. And we often discuss, some of the Muslims in the group discuss how the United States is one of the best countries to live in for a Muslim because of the freedom of religion and because of the economic opportunities. And so I'm just saddened by these images, and I feel like some of the extremists might be able to recruit people because if they live in a country where there's not been freedom of speech and they see this film clip, they probably assume that the American government has something to do with it or that the American government approves it, because in their country, something like that, if it were to be shown, it would have to come from the government. And they may not understand that it could just be one filmmaker acting on their own, and the government knows nothing about it in a society where free speech is valued. So I'm just saddened by the violence, but I'm encouraged by the people in Libya who held up signs that they loved the ambassador and they were sad to see him killed, because I think people need to understand that these are a small percentage of people who are getting violent, that the majority of Muslims do not support this type of behavior, even if they are offended by the film. So that's what I'd like to say.
Thanks for calling, Mike. You're in Cleveland, Ohio, and if you want to do the same, you can phone in on country code 4420 31 62 4242. Umesh in Nepal has posted, it's really bad that movie mocked Islam and Muhammad. Opposing the bad by being bad is not good. People should calm down, he says. What else here? Michael has tweeted that the Islamic community are just being unreasonable, but someone called Nooks replied that's absolutely not true, and then referenced Pastor Terry Jones, who has been getting involved in this conversation as well in Florida. Mwenya says on Facebook, enough is enough. Don't these people have better things to do with their time? It would be better to stop giving them too much coverage. Frankly, the world has better problems to worry about than Islam and the Prophet. And I know that, Maajid, something that has been, and all the rest of the guests actually, something that's being talked about quite a lot online today is the coverage. There's a cover of the Newsweek magazine in the US, and the headline this week is Muslim Rage, alongside pictures of angry protesters. What do you think this will do to the perception of Islam around the world?
I think it's unfortunate that Newsweek's cover, my issue isn't with the fact that they featured this on their cover, because it's quite obviously a news story and we're discussing it here. I think it's unfortunate that the choice of author, because they chose an author who I've debated in New York before. The motion was, is Islam a religion of peace? And I argued that Islam is what the majority of Muslims believe it to be, and the majority of Muslims are not terrorists, and therefore by definition it must be. And she argued, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is the author on the Newsweek cover, argued that it's not a religion of peace. She's been quoted before as saying Islam must be defeated. That's a quote. She also believes that Islam is inherently violent. And I think actually no religion is inherently anything. Religions are interpreted by the majority of their followers, and we know Christianity has evolved in many ways as well. So what the problem with the cover is that when Muslims around the world see that, and they see that at this time Ayaan Hirsi Ali has been chosen to write that story, it might look like exacerbating, a deliberate move to exacerbate the tensions even more. So it's a bad political move, but nothing more than that, and it's definitely not Islamophobic.
Nirvana, I'm going to bring you in here, and perhaps developing that. The cover is about Muslim rage rather than Christian rage or Hindu rage, and the commenter earlier on, the emailer Mike, talked about The Life of Brian, the Monty Python movie from quite a few years ago now, and the contrast with that. Some people might be asking, why is it that we always seem to be talking about Islam in these circumstances rather than other religions?
Well, I have to say it's Muslim who brought that on themselves by just going into emotional rage, blind rage. I was in Turkey last week, and I noticed how people took the response to the movie was completely different. There was no massive demonstration, only very few hundred demonstrated peacefully in Ankara in front of the US embassy, and that is it. Most people say, yes, the movie was bad, we was offended, but we are not going to dignify it with a response. And I wonder if this what happened in most other countries, probably the Newsweek will not have to publish this cover at all.
Reza, come in there.
again, we seem to, be going and picking on Muslims and taking this completely out of the context which exists in the Middle East at the moment. You can't take this out of the context of colonialism, out of the context of what's happening politically inside the Middle East. They have a lot of reasons to be angry. We don't find that, for example, America is occupying India or abusing, other religions, other members of other religions in this way. But let's just take the example of predator drones, for example. Predator drones are basically extrajudicial assassinations. They are used across several countries, and they've had thousands of victims, majority of them innocent up until today. And every single one of these victims is a Muslim. So it's natural that Muslims are going to feel that they are, underneath a lot of oppression, underneath a lot of pressure. And it's very hypocritical that when Muslims then, the pressure gets released because the political leadership doesn't take the stance necessary, it then, releases and come onto the streets. Now, since these protests have taken place, you've noticed, for example, the Egyptian Prime Minister Kandil actually said America should look to ban these kind of insulting movies. Why has he been moved to say that? He's been moved to say that because that's what the Egyptian people, the Muslims in Egypt, feel. That's how they feel towards this, that these kind of movies shouldn't be permitted to be propagated
What do you
across the
think
world.
of Nirvana's point that they shouldn't be dignified? A movie like this, which is, a low-budget movie that maybe wouldn't have come to anyone's attention had it not been for the way that this is all panned out, shouldn't be dignified with a response?
Again, my point is that it's going to naturally offend the Muslims. They're going to naturally expect some kind of response, because at the end of the day, look, it was posted onto international websites and then it was translated into Arabic. So there's a deliberate provocation going on. You're basically poking someone in the face multiple times, and then you're asking a question of when he says ow, and when he reacts, you're saying, well, why is he reacting in that way? It's very hypocritical, and
so talking about hypocrisy, Reza, we Muslims would take it far more seriously if these arguments were coming from somebody who also didn't believe in colonialism. Islamist organizations who are behind much of the agitation behind these demonstrations also believe in colonialism. They believe in expansive, offensive jihad, in occupying other people's countries to impose upon them their one particular brand of Islam. And Islamist organizations such as the one you belong to also believe in believe in killing people for apostasy and blasphemy under their state. So
well,
it's not non-violent at all.
I'm just interested. This point about provocation is a fascinating one, actually, because I think a lot of people are getting in touch to talk about it. I mean, MDX in New York's just tweeted us, for example, I watched Innocence of Muslims, definitely an offensive, provocative film, but no verbal offence warrants a militant response. Zini says on Facebook, anytime I see these protests, I laugh and shake my head in sadness. The protests are all just an excuse, and a very big excuse at that. On provocation, Asra, we've not heard from you for a while. If this is very obviously a deliberate provocation, is that not an even bigger reason to not be provoked by it?
Well, once again, as a mother, I can say that I would advise my son, it's you who must take responsibility if you're provoked. It's us as Muslims who have to take responsibility if we're provoked to anger. I believe that I agree with what Maajid is saying about the choice of the author of the article, but at the same time, that image of the Muslim anger, the images that we see, they are a mirror on our society. They're a mirror on the kind of anger and resentment that somebody like Reza is expressing. I'm sitting here right now with the FBI affidavit on this young kid in Chicago who was going to blow up a bar in Chicago. And what does he use as his justification? He says the United States and the UK, they do bad things. They mutilate children, they rape women, they nuke innocent people. So that kind of grievance and wounds that Reza speaks about, it stokes these kids into more anger, more rage, and more violence. I think it's completely irresponsible to suggest that there's no complicity. When you feed the anger, you're as responsible for the violence that ensues. And in that way, in our community, we are instigating ourselves.
Yes, and I think we can protest against drone strikes, we can protest against illegal invasions without having to peddle totalitarian solutions ourselves. And I think the Arab uprisings originally were about that. The young people that came out in Egypt and other countries to overthrow their dictators were originally inspired by unemployment issues and a desire for freedom and democratic change in those countries. And I think it's a shame that the grievance narrative has been hijacked by organizations that have their own totalitarian worldview that they'd like to impose over Muslims once they remove the dictators. And that's what I meant by half-truths. They don't tell us the other half of the truth, that their solution to their grievances against America and Britain and other countries, and there are legitimate grievances, of course, but their solution is so often so much of the same. They wish to impose over us another form of dictatorship.
Absolutely.
They impose one version of Islam over us.
If I could just suggest also, to Reza, to everyone, I grew up hearing these grievances in my living room. I heard them from my father. I heard them from all the uncles. But, we have to choose how we're going to respond to the grievances. I know that beneath the anger is a lot of hurt. It's a lot of pain. And I'm sorry to you, Reza, for that pain. I'm sorry to you for the very legitimate sadness that you may feel over all of the grievances that you talk about. But just as Nirvana said, we have to respond with grace. Argentina had the same extrajudicial type of shootings that you talk about. South Africa has that, Adam. The Irish have their complete culture of grievances. We have to choose as societies how we're going to move forward, and we must choose a path of grace so that we are representing the best of our faith.
You're listening to World Have Your Say. You can post on facebook.com/World Have Your Say as you listen to us discuss the images of the protests in lots of countries around the world over the video clip posted on YouTube. And somebody called L has just emailed me in response to the daily email we send out saying these protests simply call attention to what the protesters are protesting. This raises curiosity and thereby vastly increases the number of people who will then seek out the film just to see what all the foo-for-roar is about. I've got no idea what foo-for-all means, but I think it must mean hullabaloo in maybe the part of the world that Al is writing from. This, of course, serves to guarantee lots more viewers than if they'd ignored the initial protests. Reza, do you worry that this is being counterproductive, that raising the profile of such a film will only mean that lots of people go to seek it out?
I do worry about that, and I do advise everyone not to go and seek out the film. And I also advise that when Muslims go and protest against this movie, that they do it inside a peaceful way. And I fully support the right of Muslims all around the world, and they do go out on the streets and protest, the majority of them inside a peaceful way. And I encourage the Muslim leaderships around the world to show a greater leadership, a unified leadership, which would expose this. And as you know, as I pointed out before, previously these issues used to occur and they used to be dealt with. You had the Ottoman Caliphate, which reacted to the provocation previously of the French playwright, and it was dealt with inside a diplomatic way. The problem here is that you don't have any political representation for these points of view, and so therefore people take to the street because they get frustrated. It's a minority who takes to the streets.
Can I make one point?
It's a minority who takes to the streets, and it's a minority within that minority who's violent. But it's just, it's completely unjust to put the magnification glass on this minority of the minority while ignoring everything which is going on inside the same context.
Nirvana, come in there and reply.
Can I just ask Reza one question? Since Salman Rushdie, give me one example of a book written to counter Salman Rushdie argument. A cartoon painting the Prophet to counter the Danish cartoon. A movie to defend the Prophet against the silly American movie. Why we can't just respond within the action, within the same category, rather just venting anger. And regarding the Ottoman Empire, do you really want a hypocritical response? So you want Western government suppress movie out of fear? Or do you suggest an open society when we can debate in a logical, civilized way and counter the argument in a nice, civilized way? Otherwise, we are doomed.
Yes, also, I'd like to say that, Reza, I'd like to ask you a question too, if I may, because, yes, I know that people have the right to demonstrate peacefully against these blasphemous films and what have you, but I think also I wish more Muslims around the world demonstrated peacefully against Al-Qaeda, because if Al-Qaeda have killed more Muslims by their own actions than any drone strike, and if Al-Qaeda have killed more Muslims than any film that's been made, blasphemous film in America, then I'd hope that you also agree, that I'd hope you'd also agree that we should be protesting as Muslims Muslims peacefully against all forms of fascism, including the form of fascism that would attempt to replace these invasions and aggressions that you're so rightly angered about, and the torture, with another form of invasion and aggression, and imposing one very strict and specific form of Islam over the rest of society. People should be allowed to have democratic societies. True?
And a number of people, Reza, I'll let you reply to that in one sec. So I just want to mention that a number of people are getting in touch to talk about freedom of expression. Ali Khan in Saudi Arabia says on Facebook, freedom of expression does not mean you have a blank check to hurt the feelings of members of a faith consisting of 1 billion people. Susan on Facebook, freedom of speech doesn't mean you should be offensive towards others, especially if it crosses the people's private zones. Another thing, religion is a private belief where no one should be involved in or mocked upon. And Nirvana, you mentioned the author Salman Rushdie, and he's been giving interviews today, in fact, to the BBC, and he's promoting the memoir of his last 20 years and the satanic verses and the furore around that and the fatwa that was issued around it. And he says it wouldn't be published today because of a climate of fear and nervousness. He said that the writers said that the banning of his book in many countries and the subsequent threats in his life had created a long-term chilling effect, as he put it. Do you think that there could be ramifications to freedom of speech around the protests that are happening now?
Absolutely, and that's a bit I'm worried about. Today in Egypt, a blogger was arrested because he posted the video on his Facebook, and because he claimed he's atheist. He was attacked by his inmates in the prison. I'm worried about the ramification in the new constitution in Egypt and whether there will be restriction on freedom of speech. I believe that if this stupid fatwa against Salman Rushdie never existed, Salman Rushdie might be famous for his previous books, but he will never had all the attention this fatwa gave him. When I bought Salman Rushdie book to read it, to try to make, in my humble way, a counter argument against it, and people were shocked you shouldn't buy this book. I wonder why. We should read these books to argue back. Otherwise, we are just afraid and we will live in fear for the rest of our life. It's sad.
Reza, come in there and talk about freedom of speech.
On this issue of freedom of speech again, I think that the whole concept of freedom of speech as a philosophy is a fallacy. It doesn't exist. So when people say we should have open society, we should have freedom of speech, we should have complete free expression, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in the West. It certainly doesn't exist in America, where, as I mentioned, people like Tariq Mahanna have been sentenced to 17 years in jail for translating e-books which were widely available on the internet. Why? Because it went against American government policy, their foreign policy on the issue. So the argument that we have freedom of speech, no, there is no real freedom of speech. And the problem here is that the argument of freedom of speech is only brought out when it comes to Muslims and it comes to insulting Islam. You know, in certain countries inside Europe, it's illegal, for example, to deny the Holocaust. It may be a foolish historical opinion, but it's illegal to deny it. Inside the UK now, you have something called glorifying terrorism. So people get sentenced to jail to jail for writing poetry, for example. So this concept that we have a freedom of speech inside the West and Muslims need to be able to accept this, it's a complete hypocrisy. We don't accept it. And Muslims inside the Middle East recognize this. They recognize that, look, you are simply saying that you have the freedom to insult Islam. And Muslims don't accept that freedom.
I think, was that Bjorn trying to come in there?
It's a completely different level, and there's a lot of blasphemy and all sorts of possible offensive speech going on in the West, and the only kind of blasphemy that threatens your life is blasphemy against Islam. And I wonder, is your recommendation that all the Christians in Europe should go out in the streets and protest every time somebody offends them? They would have to be out on the streets all the time. They don't, because they know better. As somebody mentioned very early here about the immaturity of these reactions, and Christians are offended too when they are just as offended. They feel deeply hurt. But
Bjorn, I've got to jump in there because we're coming to the end of the programme. That's what that music means. But you can carry on the conversation at facebook.com/World Have Your Say. Also on Twitter with the hashtag WHYS. We're going to be back at 11 hours GMT tomorrow.
Josh.